Are you the type of reader who typically reads books that look like this? But you want to start reading books that look like this? But I definitely think you guys have come to the right place. I am so happy to be able to share some fantasy book recommendations. If you're new to the fantasy genre, these are some books that really made me fall in love with fantasy, and I'm just so happy that I can share with you guys. So let's get right into it. Really quickly, I want to just discuss the different levels and different stages of fantasy books. There are so many different types of fantasy books that are out now that have so many different themes in them, so I want to just break them all down for you guys. Even though dystopia does not technically count as fantasy, since it does take place in a real world, it's still a wonderful place to begin your fantasy reading journey because it helps you to become more familiar with adventurous plot lines that are very different than a contemporary book. Urban fantasy is one of my favorite fantasy genres. It takes place in the real world, set in modern day, and it has fantasy and mythical elements to it, which makes it so exciting. Okay, Romantasy is probably my number one favorite. It involves a lot of different fantasy elements. It could take place in a completely different world, but the main focus is always on the romance, so this is another great place for beginners. And then we have whimsical fantasy, which definitely usually takes place in a different world. Whimsical fantasy feels like a mature Disney movie that gives you that fairy tale feeling, but is more mature and more adventurous. Then we have political fantasy, another one of my favorites. This usually involves a lot of war, a lot of politics of certain people trying to become king or queen, and it's a little bit more difficult to understand, but once you do, it's so fun to read about. Next, we have dark fantasy. This involves a lot of dangerous, gritty plot lines, and it's very different from whimsical fantasy. The atmosphere is a lot more gloomy, and the plot is a lot more serious. High fantasy is the most intimidating genre of fantasy to get into. It does always typically take place in a completely different world with so much heavy world building, characters who are likely not human, and plot lines that are so intricate to understand. Belladonna, one of my favorite books of all time. I'm so excited to be talking about this. So it basically begins with the character named Signa Pharaoh, and every single guardian that she's had has died of mysterious ways, and she eventually gets to live with her last remaining relatives, the Hawthorns, and she really loves them, okay? Like, she actually gets along with them. They don't dislike her, and they're all getting along fine, right? And then eventually something happens where Signa figures out that they are in danger, that someone could be trying to murder them. And so she decides to figure out what's going on, how to stop what's going on, because this is the only family that's been kind to her. And she makes an alliance with Death himself. He is a character in this book and he's amazing, but I will make a whole other video on why he is incredible. But anyways, they team up and it's just this amazing YA gothic romantasy, just very beautiful writing, very atmospheric, very lyrical, and very romantic. And Signa is such a lovable character, and I love that this book involves mystery as well as fantasy. It feels like so many different genres and ideas, and it all works together and is so easy to understand. This is probably a good time for me to tell you that Caraval and basically any book by Stephanie Garber is my favorite book of all time. This is one of my favorite book series ever, you guys. It's incredible. The plot is about this girl named Scarlet Dragna and her sister Donatella. They have a very evil father. Their mothers died, and Scarlet really wants to go to Caraval, this event that takes place every single year, and I think it's a week-long event. It's very magical, it's very whimsical, and it basically offers a chance of escape, a chance for them to change their lives. And so basically every single year they haven't been able to go until one year they do find a way to be able to attend this event. And Scarlet's sister, Donatella, who she is very protective over, actually ends up getting kidnapped for the whole scavenger hunt event for the week. And so Scarlet's goal is to find her sister, and she also ends up making an unexpected connection with a certain character who I'm not going to say his name because I do not want to give away any spoilers for you guys. But this book is just incredible. And the thing that I love about it so much is that, yes, it is a fantasy. It doesn't take place in the real world at all. But as Scarlet is discovering and learning about Caraval for the first time, so are you as the reader. You're seeing everything from her perspective, and this book has so much mystery, it's so romantic, and it's just really beautiful lyrical imagery and writing, and I think it's an amazing place for you to begin your fantasy journey. I wish this book had more hype, you guys. I found out about it from an Instagram account that I follow, Lynn's Library, and she had this amazing reel, and I instantly just purchased this book, and I love it so much. It's by this independent, amazing author, R.J. Rogan, and it basically follows the story of this princess named Kira who had to flee her kingdom when she was like 4 years old, and now she's all grown up, she's 18, and she has to end up going back to her kingdom to try and make peace between the kingdom of earth and the kingdom of fire. And it's just this incredible book. I love it so much. The writing is really easy to understand, but then it's also got an amazing plot line. The characters are all just amazing and they all stick out. The side characters are lovable, and then it's also got a potential arranged marriage trope and some enemies to lovers, which are two of my favorite things in the entire world. And there's also some dragons in here. I know you guys love dragons after Fourth Wing, so you also have that trope, and it's just an amazing YA debut fantasy that should be talked about so much more. And I think that it's an amazing place for you to begin your fantasy journey if you are not that familiar with fantasy books. Once Upon a Broken Heart by Miss Stephanie Garber. I love this series with all my heart. Two of these books in this series were 6 out of 5-star reads for me. If that doesn't tell you how much I love these books, then I don't think anything will. I do not want to say the synopsis or summary for this series, because if I do, then that would spoil major events that take place in Caraval, which I do believe you should read Caraval first. That way you can have a better understanding of a particular main character in this series. But I will say that the vibes in this series are so fairy tale, so whimsical, so magical, so romantic, and very emotional. You wouldn't think that a YA fantasy series could be this emotional and be this heartbreaking, but it is. Mainly with the second book in the series, which is just insane. I think that this mood board for the aesthetic really shows like what you can expect, but I would say that the main character is one of my favorite main characters I've ever read in my entire life. Like, she is just such a sweetheart, and I feel like we don't really see main characters like her a lot in fantasy books, so I really enjoyed her. And then there's a lot of morally gray characters. Another main character is very morally gray, and he's amazing. And this series just keeps you guessing, and it's just such a joy to read, and I couldn't recommend it enough. Next, we have The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. This series actually is the series that made me fall in love with fantasy again in 2022, April. I still remember when I read it for the first time. I need to do a reread. It's been too long. This series means everything to me. And like, it's the reason why I love fantasy books so much, and it's the reason why all my money goes to new fantasy books, so I should also hate it a little bit. It follows the story of Jude and her sisters who got kidnapped by a fae. This is not a spoiler, this happens very early on in the book, and they get kidnapped to the world of Elfheim. And they originally lived in like this real world, you could say, and they ended up getting transported to the other world of Elfheim. So it's like a fantasy world that exists in the real world. It's a little difficult to explain, but this series focuses very heavily on fantasy politics. It follows Jude as she tries to reach her ambitions and reach her goals while dealing with a lot of bullies in Elfheim, one of them being Carden, who seems to give her a really hard time. And is it because he hates her, or is it because of something else? I think we know what it is. But yeah, this series is amazing, and it's so different than any other fantasy series that I've really read. And you should not go into this just for the romance, because it's not super romance heavy. It does get a little bit more romance centered later on in the series, but this is really just about our girl Jude trying to reach her goals and be ambitious and try to survive in this crazy world. And she is a morally gray character, which is so interesting to read about a female main character in a fantasy book who is morally gray, who will do whatever she needs to do to survive. And I could not recommend this book enough. This is City of Bones by Cassandra Clare. I do not know if you guys have seen the TV show. I tried to watch a couple episodes of it and I just really did not like it. But I saw the movie, and the movie was not that good either. But the only good thing about that film was Jamie Campbell Bower as Jace, okay? But anyways, this book is an urban YA paranormal fantasy. It takes place in the real world, specifically New York City, and it follows the story of Clary Frey. She thinks she's just a regular, ordinary teenage girl, until one day her mother disappears, and this leads to Clary finding out that she is a part of this angelic race of shadow hunters, and their goal is to destroy demons who make it into the real world. And so this book is basically a journey of Clary learning this whole other side to herself and making new friends and learning a lot from Jace, who is a very well-respected shadow hunter, and there's also a little bit of romance as well. I really liked this book. I gave it 4 stars. It wasn't like the best thing I've ever read, but as I was reading it, I was like, this would be perfect for someone who doesn't typically read fantasy, because A, it takes place in the real world, and then B, it still gives you some fantasy elements that you can learn and grow into. I think it's a really fun book to start out with your fantasy journey, and I really do recommend it. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. This is one of my first like long videos that I've done, so I was a little bit nervous doing it. Please take a massive gulp of water every time you hear me say I could not recommend this book enough. And I have so many other book recommendations that I want to do as well for new fantasy readers. So if you would like a part 2, please let me know. And if you enjoyed this video and want to see similar content like this, I would love it if you would subscribe and like and share this video. And I will see you guys in the next one. And as always, happy reading.